strange to be speaking English, but I'm very happy to be here this afternoon to present to you Professor Teresa Blankmeyer Burke. She's from the University of Gallaudet in Washington, D.C., in the United States. She is involved in 3 areas of research that I think are going to interest us all this afternoon. She is principally involved in philosophy, but also deaf studies and bioethics in the medical area. I'm not going to talk anymore because Professor Teresa is going to tell you much more about herself and her research. But I would just like to thank her very much for her contributions here to this program.
Okay, testing. Excellent. First of all, thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here. I will talk to you today about a project that I am doing in what I call deaf philosophy. It's a new area, and I think it will be an area topic of interest to you. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a first for me to be looking at slides in Portuguese and to be giving a talk in spoken English. I want to just give you an overview first, so I will give you a brief introduction, and then I will talk a little bit about the objectives for our time together, talk a little bit about ethics, values, and ideas, and the concepts of the meaning of life and philosophy of the self in this deaf philosophy project. I will also give you an example of my ASL core project, which I hope will illuminate some of these ideas. So I want to just do a quick check. How's everything going with spoken English? If you're accessing the talk through spoken English, can you hear me? Am I clear? Okay. If you're accessing through Libras, is it clear? Everything's going well? It's standing in the right place? We have a lot of things going on here. So far, so good? Yes. Okay, muito bem. So I want to talk a little bit about why I'm using spoken English. I grew up hard of hearing. This is a picture of me as a girl with my hearing aid. You can see at that time my biggest goal in life was to be a baton twirler, not a philosopher. Somehow I ended up here. It's all good. But this, I thought also it's a nice way of showing that our aspirations and dreams can change through life. And I keep trying not to move my hands because I know you're watching the interpreter and I don't want to create any visual noise. So I'm going to hold my hands like this. Never done that for a talk, ever. All right, so we have this notion in deaf studies of a deafhood journey. And for me, I grew up at about age 3. My mother noticed that I wasn't hearing her, responding to her when I didn't see her. And so she took me to the doctor and she said, I think my daughter is not hearing me. And the doctor said, no, you're wrong, and just dismissed her. And then age 5, I began school. The teacher thought the same thing. And this time with the teacher's expertise, professional expertise, my mother went back to the doctor. They did an audiogram and all the tests that deaf and hard-hearing children will go through. And they said, oh, yeah, she has hearing loss. She's not able to hear these vowels, these consonants, so on and so forth. I got hearing aids. I was put in mainstream education. At the time in California, we had pretty strong support for deaf and hard of hearing children. So I went all the way through mainstream education, all the way through until I finished my PhD. And then I got to Gallaudet. First time ever, I'm in a classroom where everyone signs, and it sort of blew my mind. It was very exciting. It transformed my life. Because of that experience of having the young life experience of knowing what it's like to be the only deaf or hard of hearing person in the room, and then to move into a situation where I'm just one of everyone else, it was something that helped me think through, how do we do philosophy as deaf people? What is this big project for us as deaf people? So that's a little bit of my journey. I got my PhD at the University of New Mexico in a long time ago now, 2011. And I was told that I was the first deaf signing woman in the world to get a PhD in philosophy. I don't know if that is absolutely correct. That's what Gallaudet told me, but I don't know what, as far as Europe and the English-speaking countries, yes. I do not know if in Latin America, maybe there's other deaf people with PhDs in philosophy. I just don't know. And it's not that I want to say this to be like, look at me. It's more to give you a sense of, when you're the first deaf person, there's always challenges and difficulties that you have to figure out on your own because no one else has done it before. Okay, so my research area, I work in bioethics, mostly genetics, and there's a very interesting genetic issue coming up now with, it's called otoferlin, OTOF gene. And I'd be happy to give a talk on that. It's very complicated. It's not, I'm not going to go through that now, but the potential for that to change the future of the number of deaf children in the world is significant, and other technologies for other genes are on the way. And so as a deaf person, I have a lot of concerns about this technology and the ethical issues related to it. I do philosophy of language, deaf philosophy, ethics, feminist philosophy, epistemology, and in deaf studies, most of my work is ethics and epistemology related. So that's who I am. Next slide. Oops. Okay, so my expectations for this, I'm going to talk for a while, and then I will be quiet and listen to your questions and feedback. And I hope we have a dialogue where we create philosophy together, because my view of philosophy is it is a dialogue in process. It's not like the expert comes in and gives a talk and then leaves, and you absorb that and you just add it to your little bag of all the things you know. I think it's much more important to have an engaged process of dialogue. And so that's good for this. Next slide. So thinking about ethics, values, ideas. As human beings, what is the thing that is most important to us? And for each of us, we'll have a different answer. So I want to take a moment to just pause and let you think about what's most important to you as a human being, as a whole person. I know people want to reply. I want to do the philosophy part now, but I'm going to be quiet. We're going to have the talk first, and then we'll do the philosophy. So I'll give you my answer, and then we can talk more about your answers. For me, what's most important is living on a healthy planet, being a part of a community of family and friends, of people who love and support each other, and having diversity in my world, whether that's diversity of ideas, diversity of human beings that I interact with, diversity of places I get to have the privilege to go. But these are some of the things that are really important to me as a human being as I travel through my years on this planet. The next question is a little different. And that's the question of what is most important to you as an academic or as a scholar. And I think that so often we can disaggregate parts of ourselves. Oh, there's the academic part of me. There's the part of me when I'm with my friends, and these different parts of ourselves. But thinking about where you are now in your academic journey, I'm sorry, the hands have to go down. Where you are in the academic journey, most of you, I think, are starting your graduate education, your master's, your PhD, and just really getting started. And there is this question of, how do I best invest my time as an academic? Where do I put my work? And that ties to the first question, because if you don't have a clear sense of what's important to you with your ethics and values, it's harder to make these two pieces come together, whether it is the value of being a scholar or the value of your whole life as a human being. So this is a photo that is, I don't know who that is. I got it off the internet. I'm so sorry, but it looked like he was signing, and that's why I like it. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to dive into some of the concepts of the philosophy of the self and of the signing self. Now, the meaning of life in philosophy is an academic subdiscipline. So you have things like ethics, aesthetics, epistemology, logic, and you also have political philosophy, social philosophy. You also have things like meaning of life as a subfield. And in this subfield, one thing is we ask this question of what is my purpose in life? And there are different models of answers to that question of what is my purpose. So one model is the model of the big life project and how you structure your life so that all of your activity is aimed, all of your activity is aimed at this big life project, and everything that you do, you really want to move it in that direction. If you are a philosopher, maybe you're a little bit familiar with some philosophy, a philosopher named John Stuart Mill, who is known for his utilitarian ethics. He had utilitarian ethics. His life was all about trying to figure out how to have the greatest amount of good in his life and the least amount of harm. And he not only did that for himself personally, but was looking at this from the perspective of a society. So he's just one example of somebody whose life was very much focused on trying to justify the life through a particular philosophy or idea. The one example. And so that would be project life. Another is more of a retrospective. And for this, you need to have enough experience of years to be able to look back and say, okay, I did this, I did that, and these different things that you did, you can then, after some time, construct a narrative that explains what your life's purpose has been looking back retrospectively. So that's a very different sort of approach. It's almost the polar opposite than the approach where I use John Stuart Mill. Now, there are many, many, many other models of this meaning of life, life projects, perspectives. But one that I like is this idea of a fragmented self. And part of the reason I like it so much is because I think it captures something that happens for us as deaf people. Not all of us, because we have so many different experiences as deaf people or members of the signing community. But let me give you a classic example, and I'll use my own example because I don't want to violate confidentiality with anyone. So when I was in first year college, university, I was taking a political science class. I thought I wanted to be a politician. And I thought, okay, I will go to this big conference at the Capitol in California. University students from the entire state of California were sent there. And I was very much in my, I'm hard of hearing, but I'm not going to tell anyone, and I'm going to pretend to be hearing phase. So I get there, and the same thing happens that always happens when I'm in a big group. You know, people are talking, I'm just nodding my head because I don't understand everything, but I want to look like I understand, and so on. And then I see in the corner, there's a group of people using sign language. And I knew just a little bit. I knew the alphabet. I could say like, my name is, and introduce myself. And maybe I knew like 100 words in ASL. But I was bored because I'd been at this conference and there wasn't a lot for me to get out of it. So I walked over to these deaf people. I introduced myself, and if the interpreter can pause, I'll show you. So I'm like, you know, I'm very awkward with signing. I'm introducing myself. And their reaction was beautiful. It was welcoming, it was inclusive. They just did something that many of us, and I don't want to cry because I'm so emotional, but it was such a moment of recognition that it shifted, it fragmented myself from before I was in the signing community and after I was in the signing community. There I go with my hands again. So I like this idea of the fragmented self because I believe it does a good job philosophically of explaining how our lives, in our lives, we can be in many ways different people in such a way that we've had a transformation of who we are. And so this is one example. There's one more. And this is the idea of what we call an aesthetic self. You often see artists will develop a way of living, and they might have, I just was reading about an artist this morning who decided to do performance art and art as life as art. And she decided that she was not going to speak to any other women for 28 years, where she decided she was just going to stop speaking to women and only speak with men. And she's now been in this process for 28 years. So this is an example of designing your life as art. She believes that, and she did a lot of other different things, but you construct your life and your life choices around some kind of artistic vision, whatever that is. Oscar Wilde, I don't know the Oscar Wilde, yeah, is a historic example of someone who has made that kind of a choice in building an aesthetic life. So again, this notion of philosophy of the self and what is the signings of is something that I think might be interesting to explore in terms of deaf philosophy and in terms of who are we as academics, whether we're early in our career, mid-career, later in the career, and what are the choices we make according to our ethics and our values and our ideas about the world we want to live in, and how do those choices about our research impact and align with these ethics and values. How are we doing on time? I'm sorry I'm not tracking the time. We're good with time? Okay. Okay, perfect. So in talking about research, we have research that's empirical. You go out into the field, you collect data, and then you analyze the data, and you check to see, does it align with your hypothesis, what findings do you have, and so on and so forth. That's whether you're in the sciences, whether it's physics or chemistry or biology or math, or whether you're social scientists, psychology, sociology, and that is not what I do. I do philosophy, theoretical. However, I think you can lean on the empirical data and the science in order to inform your non-empirical research. And so that's big picture. Now some questions are to ask yourself, what are the norms of your discipline? And where do we as deaf academics challenge those norms? And where do we engage with those norms? So for example, in philosophy, we have a norm of lots of dialogue about what we write. Well, for me, yes, I'm speaking English, I read lips. One-on-one, I can do the philosophy practice of a back and forth dialogue. But put me in a situation where we have a philosopher presenting to a room full of philosophers, and then I bring in the interpreter, and it pushes the norm, it challenges the norm. You have to subvert the way you do it in order to have the practice continue. So thinking about your field, your discipline, what are the norms that were established by hearing people, and what are the norms that you as a deaf person or as a signing person bring to the field? So using that novel lens for the field, how can you align your contributions, your goals with the research projects that you're currently involved in, that you're about to embark on? And then, of course, always identify what might be some of the restrictions and how can you possibly, or constraints, move past those. So next slide. Okay, I have to do the translation in my head. Hold on. All right, so approaching the task. One thing I think is good is to think about developing as sighted deaf people, and I am a sighted deaf person, I am not a deaf blind person. My habits of observation are very much what we call deaf eye oriented. Oh, yes, I want to make sure we got that. Thank you. And so I observe a lot of different things, and not always the same things that the hearing people in the room might notice or observe. And so this habit of observation often will lead to questions. Again, going back to my project, my big project of deaf philosophy, there in philosophy we have a way of reasoning that we call inductive reasoning. You have a set of let's just call them facts or observations, And then from that, you try to pull out some idea from it. It's different than working with deductive reasoning where it fits a particular form and proof. So we humans all do this inductive reasoning. It's not like anything that's unique to deaf people, but deaf people are put in, we live in a society that is not designed for us. So our use of inductive reasoning becomes much more keen and attuned. And that is something that can benefit your research, because this leads us to question, why are they doing it this way, not that way? And that question is a way of saying, maybe this is something to pay attention to in research. So I encourage you to cultivate these questions, pay attention to how you are taking in the world with your eyes, what questions come up for you. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about resisting just a simple answer to, I think that's important. Sometimes you have a question and you ask, well, why is it this way? Oh, it's just that way, or oh, because X, Y, Z. And push beyond that, go past that. And the last thing I want to mention, I've never explained this concept in spoken English before, so bear with me. In philosophy, we have this phrase of orthogonal approach. I have to use my hands, so I hope it's not going to be too distracting. So you have one person, one set of ideas here, one set of ideas there. And let's say the concepts of what people are talking about, it's using the same terminology, the same words. So you think, oh, it's like this. There's a lot of overlap. But suppose the words and the concepts, the words are the same, but the concepts grounding those words are different. So instead of this, where you have this area where you can all talk, you now have this area where it pulls apart. Okay, good. And this orthogonal thing is something to pay attention to. So even if you're having a discussion, the words are the same, what are the concepts that are grounding that? And again, going back to being in a signing community, being a deaf person, how do those influence what we're doing? You all with me so far? Still, so far so good. I know you're not philosophers, so I try not to bore you too much. Okay, so now, deaf philosophy, I've been talking about it, dancing around it. And so one question is, well, what is deaf philosophy? I get this from hearing philosophers all the time. And my answer is, well, I can look at it two ways. One is we can take all the questions, all the topics, everything that's in the world of mainstream academic philosophy, and we can just add a deaf twist to it. So in bioethics, you have questions about genetics. Now you add this question about the OTOF gene and how that could impact eradicate the existence of a signing deaf community. Ultimately, one ethical question, what kinds of people should exist in the world? Who makes these decisions? So you can take regular philosophy, mainstream philosophy, and just add deaf-related questions to it. That's one way. Another way, and this is what I've been hinting at prior to this, is you can say, what is it to be a deaf person in the world? What is it to be a deaf human being? What is it to have our bodies, our minds, everything oriented in a signing deaf way? Now that raises this question of, maybe there's a different way to do philosophy than we have established in the spoken language world. What does it look like to have an argument on the hands, not on the words in the air? So what does it look like to show objections and replies in a sign language rather than a spoken language? Are there features of sign languages that lend themselves to philosophy in interesting ways that spoken language philosophy has not uncovered. So all of this is the stuff I've been sort of focusing on for the last few years. And I think it's really, it's consumed my life. And to have a research project that gives you a lot of pleasure, and also because you feel like it makes a contribution to your community in terms of possibly inspiring others to pursue this further, in terms of validating the pursuit of philosophy, in terms of asking questions about who we are as deaf people in a way that is not diminishing, but enhancing flourishing, is a way that deaf philosophy can contribute to what we are, what we do and who we are. So there are many ways and justifications for deaf philosophy. And I have spent a career trying to show that this does exist. I no longer get so many questions about, deaf philosophy, what's that? Does it really exist? It's more, what are you doing now with your deaf philosophy project? So some legitimizing has happened, partly because I'm stubborn and I keep talking about it. And I think partly because I have talked about it so much that I got past that initial resistance to, okay, let's think about it and take it from there. Next slide. So, big question. If we are talking about how deaf people do philosophy, do we need to have specialized vocabulary, just as the mainstream hearing philosophy has specialized vocabulary, in order to make this happen? Now, I think we can be philosophical in everyday conversation. It doesn't take, you don't have to have a PhD in philosophy to be philosophical. But if you are, if you are to join the academic business of doing philosophy, you need to be able to engage with the vocabulary, with the lexicon, with the history of the field. You need to have a certain set of things. Now, how do we get from, for example, I will only use ASL for my example because I don't know anything about Libras. In ASL, we don't have a lot of words, we didn't have a lot of words that were philosophical in nature. When I came to Gallaudet 20 years ago and taught my first philosophy class, almost every time I had a technical word, I either fingerspelled it or I made up a sign, and then we would use that sign for that day or maybe that whole semester, and then it would sort of go away, and then the next time we have a class, we do the same thing, and it's this cycle. And I was never really satisfied with it. I started this when I was in graduate school, and I met up with a team of interpreters who had been interpreting philosophy at Rochester Institute of Technology, and Rochester University is in New York, and they have the National Technical Institute of the Deaf there. And that university has a lot of deaf people who take philosophy. It's one of these universities that has 7 different universities within. So the deaf part of the university is separate from the part of the university that has philosophy. But if the deaf person wants to get a degree in something that's not offered at the deaf university, they go across the campus. And so a lot of deaf people were taking philosophy. A lot of interpreters were interpreting philosophy. And they were very frustrated because A, they didn't have the right signs, B, they didn't have the knowledge, the deep knowledge of philosophy to really come up with good signs. C, the professors didn't know any sign language. So we had all of these gaps, and then deaf people are the ones who lose because there's not the expertise, there's not the support, and how do they move on for that? So I worked with this group, and we had a team. We decided from the beginning, we wrote a grant, we got money, that it had to be deaf-led. That was super important. And we had 5 of us deaf, and then we had the interpreters who were part of the university, were support and expertise of what the experience of interpreting was like in these philosophy classes. So I'm the philosophy expert, but ASL is not my first language. I don't have a native language user's intuition. I don't know, oh, this sign is good and this one is not. So that's why we had 4 people. Of those 4, one is a very well-known, super famous in the US actor who happened to have deaf actor, who happened to also have, and poet, who had a master's in divinity and religion, which is pretty close, has a lot of overlap with vocabulary philosophy. One who had a PhD, another deaf woman, PhD in English, but her second concentration was philosophy, like a minor. And then we had one other who had a background in philosophy as an undergraduate, and then one man who was just like super brilliant, certified deaf interpreter. And he like knows ASL like no one else. So these are the ASL experts. And then I'm the philosophy expert. And we had conversations about, okay, we have this big task. I have a list of all these words that come up when you're taking like the introduction to philosophy class, or the beginning introduction to ethics, or history of philosophy, or all the courses that maybe you take as an undergraduate. And I got together, we had the foresight to, in our grant, write for making sure we had cameras all over the room to capture the whole discussion. And we met for 3 years, 1 whole week for each year. And we start with the letter A, and the first word is aesthetics. And the one man who was not versed in philosophy is like, well, what does that mean? And I say, well, it's questions like, what is beautiful? How do you know that something is beautiful? What is ugly? What is the role of art in our human existence? And I'm just throwing out all these different examples of aesthetic questions. And he was a mischievous man, okay? So very playful. And he starts with, oh, well, aesthetics, beauty, okay, we'll do this. And I'm like, no, that's not appropriate, because A, we're creating a lexicon. We need to think about like how this looks to hearing people in professional settings. B, I am a feminist, and I do not want to import some of the biases of our society that I think are negative into the lexicon as we're developing this project. But I said, you have the right idea, because you want to somehow in the sign convey this notion of beauty. So then we had a big discussion, and we said, okay, so part of it is you have an exchange of the person and then the thing out there that you're regarding and asking questions, whether it's questions about, is this thing beautiful? Or what is the role of this thing in the discussion of beauty? So, but you have the person and you have the thing out there. And then you also have an engagement piece. So then the sign sort of shifted from this to this, hands like so. In ASL, if you have 2 hands moving, and I'm not a linguist, but you have 2 hands moving, you can't, and they're doing a lot of movement, you can't have a lot of changes of hand shapes. So we had this, like this is the thing that you're regarding, and then you have the person and the thing and the exchange. So this becomes aesthetics. Now, we've been using this sign for a while, and many of you, if you study linguistics, you probably know that sometimes what happens in linguistics, sign languages, I don't know if it also happens with spoken languages, signs will shorten. So a classic example, in American Sign Language, we used to have, the sign for help used to be like this, where you're sort of helping a person, and now it's this. So things kind of move towards the center. And so we were thinking about how would a language possibly tend to shift, who is going to be looking at the language, all these questions as we're developing this lexicon. How are we doing on time? We good? Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the lexicon. And these are questions, ethical questions, that are super important because of the history of the deaf community. So one question is, who has a right to add to language? I don't know very much about the history of sign language here in Brazil, but in the United States, we had a period where we had American Sign Language, and then we had a lot of educators who took signs, words from American Sign Language, and changed it and made it Sign English. They changed the word order. They did a lot of changes, so it wasn't really a natural language. It was this system. And it caused a lot of harm to deaf children because they lost the opportunity to acquire a natural language, and instead they got a partial language or a partial system. And because of that, the plasticity, again, not a linguist, not a neurolinguist, but this is a shorthand potted version of the talk. The lack of exposure to a natural language for these deaf children early in their life impacted their ability to use language for the rest of their lives. Now, that's the history. It's not a pretty history. It's a pretty ugly history. It's sad because deaf children were damaged because mostly hearing educators took the parts of the natural sign language and they converted it into a system. They changed the language. And here I am saying, oh, we're going to add to the language. We're going to add philosophy terms. But I'm very, very aware that we have this history of who gets to add language, who gets to add to a sign language, and who doesn't. And what harm can be caused when you add to a sign language. So that's one big, big, big ethical question. Another one is, and I referred to this a little bit about like the inherent biases of a society. When you add to a language, what are you bringing with you? What are your biases? What pieces are you bringing with you? I'm sorry, my eyes, I'm so used to being like teaching in a classroom and I'm like, oh, hands are moving. So the area of expertise is tricky. I talked about our project. So I had philosophy expertise and I had some expertise in ASL. I definitely had expertise for teaching philosophy in sign language. But I did not have the first language users expertise. And that's what my other team members had. And the other people, the interpreters who were part of the project, they brought their expertise as interpreters in philosophy classes where there's one deaf person and everyone else is hearing, including the instructor. And if we are to talk about who gets to add to a language, one question is, well, what's your expertise? And it's a very weighty feeling to have a sense that what I'm bringing, my particular philosophical training is what I'm bringing to the project. And I know I'm one person. I chose particular courses to study, and so it's a very narrow thing. Ideally, a project like this, you have 10 deaf philosophers, but there's just me. So what do? We go ahead and hope that in the years to come, it will shift. Okay, now questions of epistemology. Next slide. Sorry, one more. Yes, thank you. Epistemological issues or questions. Some of it can be connected to norms of language and language use, wordplay. How does this fit into developing a lexicon or a glossary? When we create a new word, what sort of principles do we want to have behind that? So maybe, and what we ended up doing after many hours of discussion, I took the full first day or two to figure this out, is we said, if we have a set of concepts that are related in philosophy, we're going to use specific hand shapes to indicate those concepts. And those hand shapes will then do two things. One, it serves as like a root for the word and the cluster of words that are connected. But it also will be good for reminding and helping people remember, oh, this is part of the metaphysics vocabulary, this is part of the ethics vocabulary, this is part of the epistemology vocabulary. So each cluster of vocabulary words in a subfield had particular hand shapes and movements, and I'm happy to show all of this on the website at the end of the talk. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the principles behind this. We needed community acceptance. If the community says, oh, that's nice, but they don't use it, what's the point? And then it's tricky because community acceptance means what exactly? Like your everyday deaf person, deaf people in the academic community, who is part of this? Interpreters. And there's one more concept, philosophical. I'll just throw it out there. We can talk more about it later. So there's a philosopher by the name of Miranda Fricker. She's British, now she's in the US, and she created this concept of epistemic injustice, or she labeled it epistemic injustice. She didn't actually create it. There were others who referred to it, but she's known for this concept. And what this means is you have situations where there's injustice, and the injustice is connected to both ethics and epistemology. I'll give you an example and then I'll explain it. So suppose you have a situation where there is a deaf person, only deaf person in the room with an interpreter, and the interpreter is not a good fit to the assignment, just a terrible fit. And so what happens here is the deaf person after like 10 minutes goes, I can't do this. So then the deaf person goes to the hearing person who was in charge of arranging the interpreting and says, this is not working, I need a different interpreter. But that hearing person who doesn't know anything about sign language, who can't assess it, maybe that person's in the room, let's say for the example, let's say that person's in the room, the person's like, it's fine, I see their hands moving, they're fine, I don't know what you're talking about, what you're complaining about, it's fine, keep going. So that response, it's fine, the dismissiveness is an ethical issue because the deaf person was disregarded and not respected in that assessment. But what also happens is the epistemic injustice piece of it is the deaf person's expertise, the knowledge of the language, the knowledge of what a good interpreter looks like, is also disregarded. And so when we talk about epistemic injustice, it's often in these cases where a person who maybe in society doesn't have as much standing, as much power in the society, that person gets dismissed and their expertise gets dismissed in part because of who they are, what their identity is. So epistemic injustice is this field, this notion of philosophy that we're working through to deal with these questions of when someone gets disregarded, not because you have a disagreement. It would be very different if the hearing person knew sign language and said, no, this is a good interpreter, then explains why, and they have a back and forth about why it's not a good fit. This is someone who is completely ignorant of the language, of interpreting, and they're dismissing the person who has the expertise. And you can feel the passion in my voice gets a little more. So what this epistemic injustice looks at is two kinds. One is testimonial. That's the example I gave you, where a person is saying, this is not working. They're testifying, and the testimony, the language they're using gets disregarded and dismissed. The other kind is more fit with this project. This is the idea that you have concepts in one community, and maybe even words, but let's just go with concepts and the concepts don't have a word attached in another community. And so without the right words and vocabulary, it's much harder to move forward in the philosophical, but also in the regular discussion. Classic example. I don't know what the word for autism is here in Brazil. Word for autism? Okay. Interesting. I'm seeing a variety of signs. That's why I can't wait for the discussion. Okay. So that word comes up in the literature, the written literature, the academic literature. You start to see it in the 1970s, and to the best of my understanding, the American academic Tom Humphreys is the one who comes up with this term and starts using it in his writing. In ASL, we do autism because it's all about focusing on the ear. And so once that word was named, that concept was named, that feeling of every deaf person can explain, oh, I know what that is. But until you have the word attached to it, it becomes much more difficult to have these philosophical discussions about it. Another concept that is relatively recent that has been brought in through the signing deaf community is this notion of language deprivation. Now it's becoming much more commonly used, but it describes a particular set of experiences that is known in this community. And so words like this, concepts like this, have to be part of the philosophical lexicon because they're part of deaf philosophy. Here I go with my hands again, I'm so sorry. So some linguistics considerations, and this is my weakest area because it's not my field. So when we talk about the use of language, I do a little bit of philosophy of language, but only from a social perspective. So language can shape and reflect our social biases. And then you have questions as you're creating a lexicon. What feels natural to a native user and what signs don't work? And even like I'm learning Libras, and there's some hand shapes that I cannot, like 6, it just doesn't feel on my American Sign Language hands. Little things like that. You're just trying to figure these things out. Another one is when you are having philosophical conversations, there's certain ways of doing that have a linguistic structure and form. So all of these linguistic considerations, ethical considerations, epistemological considerations come together in this project of how do we create ASL vocabulary in philosophy so we can move with this project of deaf philosophy. The goal is not the vocabulary. The goal is to have the vocabulary as a tool to get forward. But the project of the vocabulary is also philosophically interesting. Next slide. Okay. So I've been talking about my philosophical lexicon and deaf philosophy, and you may be thinking about your research project, what you want to do with your academic career and your life, and how to get started. And one of the things, once you identify what you want to do, how it aligns with your values, is you need to think, well, what resources do I need? In my case, the resource I need a vocabulary that could be used by more than me, and that we could start to have philosophical discussions with. But in order to do that, I needed to have money, I needed to have a team, and all of these things. And when you're creating a novel project, you can get one of two responses usually. One is, oh, that's so amazing, that's really cool, absolutely, we're going to fund it. The other one is, what? I don't quite understand what you're doing. And there's a little bit of resistance. And I think so often for those of us working in sign languages who are deaf, we have to do so much educating of the people who control the money, who control the grants, who review the grants, that it becomes almost, it's not impossible, but it's much harder because we can't assume a certain basis or foundation of knowledge. And then the other part, this is my last question, and I think is my last point. If you are what we in the US would call an underrepresented academic, and usually in some fields that might mean it's connected to gender, in some fields maybe it's connected to your race or your ethnicity, if you're deaf, if you're hearing, if you're disabled, if you're gay, if you're trans, different kinds of identities can shape this. And if you are perceived as being part of a academic underrepresented group, you have the advantage of people notice you, and then you have a disadvantage of they notice and remember you. So if you misstep, and this is something I want to make really, really clear to deaf people in the room, if you're one of very few deaf people in your field, everyone's remembering you as that deaf philosopher, that deaf person. And if you come across as being too demanding because you're asking for interpreters all the time at every conference, and that costs money, and if you are viewed in ways that are not collegial, you can have your very early career can be sabotaged. And so it's really important to think in terms of not, okay, your ethics, your values, your project, your research, your advocacy, and the advocacy not just for the community, but for yourself so you can do this work. And then how do you do it in a way that doesn't get the hackles up of your, of the people in your field? And it's hard. I will not be the first to say that it's hard, but it's things that you need to strategize about. Next slide. Oops. That's English. I forgot to delete that. I apologize. Okay. So the ASL core project in philosophy has grown. So philosophy was the first one we did. Now they have biology and history and literature. It's a massive project. So that was really exciting. That was not my goal. That kind of the interpreters at the other university took off with that. But we have some really positive results. The money ran out. I'm still looking for money. Situation in the US now is not good for the humanities, for philosophy. It's not good for the academic world. It's a very difficult situation with the government. There's not a lot of money coming our way. So the amount, let's say, now it's this, and everyone's fighting over that little bit that's left. So I'm trying to figure out how can I continue this project and with no money to pay people. I can do it for free. For myself, I'm willing because I have a salary, I'm a professor, but everyone else should be paid. And so I don't know yet how we're going to make that happen. But one thing that we did is we started collecting the data on impact. And we have a website that gets, tens of thousands of hits a year. And most people that give feedback on it are interpreters, usually interpreters who are in an area where maybe there's one or two deaf people in a state that's very rural. And so it really benefits those deaf people because otherwise they'd be kind of stuck with that situation I began with, where you're just making up a sign and it's not cohesive. And so that was one thing that we learned. We use the signs at Gallaudet. I love to see the students using them, and also how the students will shift and change them and modify them in their discussion. Because that's the beauty of language, right? We just created these tools. Now the community is using them and shaping them and trying to figure out how those concepts can apply to their academic intellectual discourse. And I have received so much feedback from deaf graduate students around the world who say, I didn't do my degree in philosophy, but maybe in English or maybe in political science, something connected. And we used the website and it was very helpful. And because, remember I said, one thing we did was we created these groups of signs. So if you have a hand shape and a set of movements for a particular cluster of concepts, they could use those roots of the hand shapes, and then apply that and move forward by creating their concept and their signs for their field and aligning it. So that's super, super gratifying. And I'll wrap up here. The last is just coming full circle. So, what matters the most? What is going to be your orientation to your research? And the picture here, yes, I work at Gallaudet in Washington, D.C., but that's not my original home. I have two homes. I grew up in California, and then I lived in New Mexico, where I still have a house. This is a big week for Albuquerque, New Mexico, my town, because we have what's called the Balloon Fiesta. And this fiesta is 10 days of hot air balloons, about 1,000 hot air balloons. It's incredible. So you see the one balloon, the color in the sky and the nature. Think of that as a metaphor for you with your research, just sort of launching. Okay. And then last, thank you. I know different languages, and I hope I've given you something to chew on, and I look forward to the discussion. So thank you. Okay, let's go on.
I'm going to speak English, okay?
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Mike. Nice
Hi,
to
Mike.
meet you. Really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
My English is a little rusty, but I'm going to try speaking English anyway.
Okay, okay.
And I love philosophy. I love it very much. And there are many topics that I want to translate in sign language, because I feel that those are knowledge that are fundamental for all humans being having access.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, But I'm already working in a translation of one book, the Kybalion.
Okay.
You know it?
Kybalion.
Kybalion. Yeah. Anyway, it's a philosophy study.
Okay.
And I've been facing some challenges. For example, as a hearing person, it's really hard for me to make this translation in a way that I don't bring just signs, you know, because sometimes I can use a sign, but the signs, like the deaf person who's going to look to the sign doesn't know what it means, or even a lot of times there is no sign for the word or for the concept. And I talked to a deaf friend about it, and I tried to explain some sentence, and he translated those sentences for me, and it was amazing. It was like, oh my gosh, yes, I can do this. This is possible. We can do this. I definitely cannot do it by myself, but we can do this. Like I can bring this impact using sign language. I can bring the same impact that it is for me. But my question is,
I have to see you.
what do I do? Sorry,
Otherwise I
I'm
miss.
sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
What do I do when it comes to this concept and terms that already is too complex, even for hearing people? And I want to bring this for sign language in a way that is not just the sign, but I can express exactly what this means. Make sense?
No, I'm not sure I got the question. Do you mind? So the
No,
question
yeah,
is,
sure. The question is, how can I make this translation, these terms of philosophy, and bring this to sign language in a way that I don't use just the signs, because sometimes the signs doesn't have it does explain for itself.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I think it's a little hard to express the topics in philosophy to sign language. You know?
Okay. I got it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I like the question very much. And my answer to that is going to be partly it's the lexicon, the vocabulary, but so much of my answer is going to be me thinking about, I've been teaching philosophy for 35 years now. No, wait, how old is my daughter? 32 years. And so 20 years at Gallaudet, and then in English at a hearing school university before that. And when I moved to Gallaudet, so I was an experienced philosophy teacher by the time I got to Gallaudet. But what I didn't know was how to teach philosophy in ASL. But I did know the deaf community because I've been in it for a while. I knew the language. And I know that there are ways. I worked in social services with deaf people, some who had limited language, whether it was their reading language or their signing language, but they were victims of a failed deaf education system. So they did not have a robust one native language. But what we could do is, in explaining things to them, we could almost always explain concepts or some ideas through stories. Now, sometimes you need 2 or 3 stories to make the point, but stories and narrative play a huge role when I teach philosophy at Gallaudet. And I think, my field, ethics, it lends itself very naturally to that. If I were teaching logic, it's a little bit different, but you can do it in all the branches. We have a small department, so I teach just about everything. And so if your goal is, now translation is a little bit different than teaching, I recognize that. But sometimes the way to get to that point is through the stories and through the narrative. And once that point is clear, then what can happen is a dialogue of, here's a sign for that. And we just saw this today. Like there were a couple of times where I was watching, trying not to watch the interpreters, but also watching them out of the corner of my eye. And they're in real time adjusting the sign to fit the meaning better. So translation, and I'm distinguishing that from interpreting. I don't know if you mean that point of, with the sign language translation, we're talking about frozen text. So you're recording the text rather than interpreting, which is what is happening live here. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Hi, good afternoon. Okay, so I really enjoyed your lecture. I watched it all. One part specifically about deaf philosophy, I got that. And I was just wondering, well, I grew up in a deaf school. I went to a deaf school. I graduated as well. So I had I had hearing teachers of philosophy, but they knew Libras, they knew sign language. So normally, when we talk about deaf philosophy, we mainly talk about high school, and thinking that some public schools here in Brazil sometimes even start on like in the sixth year and sixth grade. That's okay. But I've been thinking at Gallaudet, there at the US. So how does it work in America? For example, do you have deaf philosophy from the beginning, like from the beginning of the school? From which grade? Only in high school? How does that work in the curriculum of Gallaudet, for example, and in other schools in the US as well?
Philosophy is not a subject that most US American children will be exposed to, not until they get to university. So there's nothing in high school, there's nothing if they're in elementary school. However, there are a couple little small projects. There's a project sponsored by the American Philosophical Association called Philosophy for Children, where philosophers will go to schools and bring in like philosophical discussion. But I don't know if you came in a little bit late, you might have missed a point that I made earlier. But one of the things that I was trying to make a distinction of is we can do deaf philosophy, like who are the deaf people who are doing philosophical work, what are the questions in philosophy that have a particular resonance for deaf people, or that bring in a deaf example that can enhance or expand philosophical discussion for mainstream philosophy. And then there's the project and the question of how do deaf people ourselves, how do we do philosophy? And so my research project, the grant that brought me here, is titled Doing Deaf Philosophy, because I want to talk to all of you here about how we do this in deaf community. How do we have philosophical discussion? And what are these issues that are of most importance in the deaf community? And how are these questions being integrated with the discussion of philosophy here at this university, at WFSCi, or in Brazilian mainstream hearing philosophy, and that sort of thing. So yeah. But unfortunately, in the US, we do not have exposure to philosophy. Maybe that's what's wrong with my country. I don't know. We'll see. Yes. Yes.
So it's the first time I meet you, and I really liked your lecture. It's really beautiful. I was touched, and it's very nice to see that you're the first deaf philosopher with a PhD on it. So talking, yeah. So I had two important points that I'd like to highlight. It's ethics and deaf philosophy. So how those two concepts intertwine. So that was like it's a complement to his question. So I was just wondering, in the past, there at Gallaudet, how do deaf people, how do they have a voice? How do they have an opinion in creating this deaf philosophy? How do they overcome autism, for example? Or how, like the deaf way of being, for example, how do they overcome salary differences and all of that, compared with hearing people, for example? So many of these things that we value in ethics, how do we do that? How do deaf people overcome that? For example, here in Brazil, we have some deaf people that would like to do research in philosophy, maybe, or to overcome some prejudices, like calling them deaf mute and all of that. So they would like to have a way of doing deaf philosophy in a way to overcome these prejudices, you know? And how would that work? How would that complement each other? And knowing that deaf people have this inside of themselves, there's something built within, you know, how to express themselves. But we see that in the hearing world, there is a limitation to that. There is a denial to that. So how do we overcome this if we can think about how to open the doors and motivate deaf people to do their own type of research? I don't know if you understood my question.
Thank you. You raised such important points. I don't have an answer for how we transform society, but I do have a couple of little things, bits of information that I want to just throw out, and then I'll try to give you a more rounded, holistic answer. So at Gallaudet, I want to make sure, I was told, well, I know at Gallaudet, I was the first signing deaf woman to get the PhD, to work as a professor of philosophy, deaf, at Gallaudet. There was a man who was, we overlapped by one semester, deaf man, first deaf person in the US for sure, and in the US and Europe to get a PhD in philosophy. His name was Dr. James Haynes, a brilliant man. He was my friend. He's missed every day. And when I joined the department, and he had been there for maybe 7-8 years before I got there, possibly 10. It was the first time when I joined the department that we had 2 deaf and 2 hearing. And now, so even philosophy in the long history of Gallaudet, more than 150 years, 160 years now, only maybe the last 30 years have had deaf philosophers teaching philosophy. It's always been hearing people who sign, but the hearing experience is different. The hearing way of doing philosophy, the hearing practices of philosophy is different. And so that in itself is one challenge. Everything okay? Yeah. Okay. Right. The other thing I want to mention, yes, there's the ethics as the academic enterprise. What is right? What is wrong? How do we know this thing is right or wrong? What are the reasons and justifications? What's our argument? What are the weaknesses and strengths of the argument? The back and forth of philosophy. And then there's the ethical, what we call applied ethics, where you have a real life situation that you identify as not ethical and unjust. And you, as a human being, remember I started with for our human values and what matters most of us, we have to say, how do we move forward to that? And because we have this phenomenon of what we call, some of us at Gallaudet use the expression, deaf solitaire, where you have one or maybe two deaf people in a field, so they're alone, and it's very hard to move a massive institution. I mean, the practice and field of philosophy is thousands of years old, and you have now like one deaf person. How will you transform that and shift that? So one thing you can do is you can try to somehow figure out to have allies, identify allies. And I did this in a very small way in the US by using the internet and noticing, oh, philosophers like to have all these, when blogs were popular, lots of philosophers were blogging. And so I jumped in. I couldn't jump into a spoken language conversation easily, but written, because of my background, because of my strengths with writing, I jumped in. I'm like, hey, I'm a deaf philosopher. I have a different take on this. And so I got to join the conversation, and people got to know me through that way. So that was one avenue. But the problem is deaf education. I don't know, again, what it's like here in Brazil, but in the United States, so much of it is a roll of the dice. What city were you born in? What kind of deaf school is in that city or in that state? Is it oral? Is it sign language? Is it bilingual, bicultural? Is it cochlear implants, everyone? And so there's so many variables. It's really hard for me to give a response for like what one individual could do. But I think part of what I'm seeing, I feel like my career, if I divide my career into thirds, so I have the first part where I'm just struggling to get tenure, to get done. I quit my PhD. I was done with hearing people. I was so frustrated. I was like, I'm done. You guys win. I walked away. And then I broke my ankle, and I spent almost a year like on my back with my leg up and trying to heal. And I thought a lot, and I said, no, I'm not going to let them win. I'm not. I'm stubborn. And I went back and I begged, because they kicked me out of the program. I went back and I begged, and I ate crow and just, okay. And then I did it. I got my degree and so on and so forth. But it's so hard. It's so hard. And when you're just one in a field, it's very, very difficult. So speaking of the first part of my career, just getting to the point where I get the job, and then proving myself. And now I've proven myself, and now I see my role, and I'm going to sign this, is to bring everyone up here. How do I do that? Well, talking about deaf philosophy is one way to do it. Coming to different places and talking to people so we can expand the dialogue is another way to do it. Sharing what worked for me, which happened in a particular place, particular time, particular university and culture. It may not translate to other places and times and cultures, but it might. Some of the strategies might, and it could be a dialogue that we have. So I hope that gives you something of an answer. It's not a complete answer. I wish I had a magic wand that could just give justice to all the deaf people in the world. Not my power. Thank you.
I've got the coming camera, haven't I? We haven't got much time left, but I would really like to pass on a few questions that we've had online. So I'm just going to ask you the 3 questions that I have And then if you could give the replies to those, and don't worry if you forget them, I'll remind you, okay? So the first question from Dionysian. Thinking about the two forms of deaf communities, Libras and ASL, what do you see as the differences in philosophy? Okay, it looks like we have one to two.
So I don't know that I can really answer that because I don't know the Libras community. I'm learning Libras. I don't have enough time and experience to answer the question. But maybe if you can ask me this question in a few months, I'm here until January. Maybe I have more formed thoughts by then. But at this point, it's so hard to know. I'm just focusing on this distinction between mainstream spoken language philosophy and philosophy, this deaf philosophy done in a sign language. And yes, I think it's a super important point that there could be and should probably will be, of course there will be, different ways of doing it in different languages, because just like we have in spoken languages, different concepts and way of expressing based on our experience and how we encounter the world, of course you'll see that too in the different sign languages. Great question.
So the next question from Isabella. She'd like to know whether it's really, what you think, whether it's really necessary to create these signs, or perhaps given that deaf people are accustomed to this idea of understanding signs as they're used, as they're created, she calls it emergent signs, even though they've not seen them before, do we actually need to create fixed signs for them, or just let the signs emerge?
Another excellent question. I think the context is important here. Signs, of course, will emerge, and deaf people will use signs to refer to expressions and in a conversation. But in an academic philosophical context, so for example, let's say I'm going with my students to the American Philosophical Association conference. My students know the vocabulary, the English vocabulary. They know from the readings they've done. I, of course, know the vocabulary. And we get interpreters, but we don't have fixed signs. What happens then? This is an example of why it's important to have, for particular settings, especially formal academic settings, if you have a set vocabulary, those students who have studied philosophy in different universities now have vocabulary where they can have these conversations. Now, maybe they change the sign, maybe they throw it out, and that's part of the process of language. But I think for formal academic philosophy, it's super important to have fixed vocabulary. For informal conversation, very, very different. And I think that sort of language emerging is a really good way of looking at it. Hope that helps.
Thank you. And the last one, I'm going to take the last two questions together. These are from a deaf woman, and she would like to know, how can what you've been doing, your methodology of approaching philosophy at Gallaudet, inspire teaching practices, both at UFSC and in her other question was perhaps to be applied at the school level, bilingual schools here in New Zealand.
So the application of the methodology at Gallaudet, let me just preface this to say, remember I mentioned that I entered the university and we had mostly hearing people in the department, and there were two of us, two deaf, two hearing, and then the other deaf philosopher passed away, so then there was just me. And so some of this was a little bit of politics at Gallaudet, with like a hearing deaf lens, just because of different ways of being trained. And it wasn't like necessarily, I did not feel like I was being dismissed because I was deaf, but what I was trying to explain, this example of hermeneutic injustice, didn't have concepts that they could grab onto. So I just had to do a lot of extra work. Now, I think if we want to talk about how can we apply this methodology, bring this methodology, expand the methodology to Wolfsky, we need more conversations. I'm very happy to talk to anyone. My Libras is not so great, but international, I can do okay. And then we can try to figure out, even if we have to have like, use Google Translate and have written language dialogue, that's fine. I think the idea here is we try to figure out how we talk to each other. I'm in building D, Sala 622. And then for bilingual schools, I absolutely have such a passion for doing philosophy with children. And my reason for it is children are natural philosophers. You know, children ask questions like, why is the sky blue? And they're asking not for the scientific explanation, they're asking out of their curiosity about the world and how it works. Why does this happen, not that? Why is this person doing this thing, not that? And so it's such a natural thing to do for children. And then also for ASL, and I'd be very curious to know if this is similar to Libras. So in ASL, we will often structure a dialogue or sentence with, this thing happened, and then why? So we have this back and forth where you start with the conclusion, then you have the question, and then you follow up with all the reasons. That's philosophical reasoning. That's a pattern of philosophical reasoning. We do this naturally in our language. And so for doing deaf philosophy with children in ASL, it's a very natural thing. We can kind of move with that. We also count off our reasons. We use position for the objection and the reply. There's so much that we do in American Sign Language, and probably I bet there's a lot of features in Libras that overlap, that philosophy, bringing this philosophy to children could be such a cool thing and give them a sense of what's out there in the world for them.
Thank you. I've had a one-word message from Professor Huarli saying, finish. So we've run out of time. So just going to just stand here for a moment. I'm going to do things in a slightly different order. First of all, I would like all of us here to register our gratitude to Professor Huarli, who's been organizing all the online stuff and the broadcast of your presentation. So thank you, Huarli. I would also like to thank our three extraordinary interpreters this afternoon who've all volunteered to do this, to be translating between English and Libras, which is not easy. So thank you and well done. And now I would like to thank Teresa. I think most of you don't know, this time a week ago, she was in hospital being treated for dengue. And so she's only now just getting back. So this has been an amazing physical and intellectual challenge. So thank you so much. And I think it's been a privilege for all of us to be here today, to get this new idea, a deaf philosopher talking to us about deaf philosophy here at Wolfsky. It's been marvelous, thank you. So just as a small thank you, some English tea for you. So I'd like to thank everybody present. And if anybody here would like to come and talk to Professor Teresa aqui presencial, then do come. But otherwise, thank you all, thank you everybody, and thank you, Professor Teresa.
Thank you.